Hello, once again, welcome back to the course Life of Christ. We're in class 38, and in this class, we want to look at some of the background about the Sea of Galilee and also two stories in detail about what happened with Jesus on that sea. So, first of all, I'd like to go with some background about what the Jews and other people actually thought about the Sea of Galilee. One belief that many people shared, including some of the Jews, was that the sea had monsters in it. For example, one of the myths was that Baal, the Canaanite god, defeated the sea and reigned as a god, and that he controlled the monsters inside the sea. Another myth about the Babylonian god named Marduk believed that he defeated the sea monster and then created the world. These are part of myths that were relatively current, at least within some time of the Jews and the pagans before and after the time of Christ. And so when you see that context where the sea is a dangerous place and the sea has monsters in it and the sea has to be controlled, the sea is an enemy, those kinds of beliefs, and you see that other religions and other gods had to deal with the sea and show that their gods were in control of the sea, then you start to understand some of the passages in the Bible, for example, that are in, for example, these passages here that talk about God and the sea. For example, the idea of God defeating the sea or controlling the sea. We understand a little bit better controlling, but we think defeating the sea, that almost seems like it's a living entity in itself, maybe with some evil spirits behind it. And that, in fact, is kind of close to the belief that many of the Jews and pagans had at the time of Jesus. I want to read one passage out of Psalms, and though this comes from the Old Testament, again, these were beliefs that went on for centuries. And as I read this, I want you to see what it says about people on the sea and then God in relationship to the sea, and also kind of think about this passage connected to the story about Jesus calming the sea, and see how those kind of illuminate each other. Verse 23 of Psalm 107, some went out on the sea in ships. They were merchants on the mighty waters. They saw the works of the Lord, his wonderful deeds in the deep. For he spoke and stirred up a tempest that lifted high the waves. They mounted up to the heavens and went down to the depths. In their peril, their courage melted away. They reeled and staggered like drunkards. They were at their wits' end. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distress. He stilled the storm to a whisper. The waves of the sea were hushed. They were glad when it grew calm, and he guided them to their desired haven. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for mankind. Let them exalt him in the assembly of the people and praise him in the council of the elders. Now, isn't that a cool passage? It's a psalm from the Old Testament, but if you look in the middle of that passage about being on the sea and that their wits end, and they cried out to the Lord, and he stilled the storm to a whisper, and then they were grateful and glad. That sounds like the story we're about to read. So interesting that even back several centuries before this story with Jesus and other stories of Jesus in the sea, this is the belief about how God can control the sea and save people on the sea. All right. And so those are just some of the things that come out. So the idea that he can subject the sea, starting with creation, that affirms who God is and who his powers are, that he rescues his people in cases like the Red Sea. He even divided the Red Sea and led them safely through it. And then he can save those who are in danger on the sea, like we read in this passage here. So again, interesting background there as well. Now, we also see that in the Gospels, there are many trips of Jesus on the sea. You have Jesus going from east to west. You have him, going from west to east, from Galilee over to the eastern side of the Decapolis. You have him going from Jewish territory to Gentile territory, to the Decapolis. We've mentioned before how the Jews would respond to that idea. we have him traveling from Bethsaida and also from the Decapolis back to Galilee. It's as if Jesus kind of establishes beachheads of authority on both sides of the sea in the battle against Satan. If you look at Mark, for example, just in the first several chapters, he casts out demons in the synagogue of Capernaum. And then after he goes across the sea, he casts out demons in the man who had the legion of demons in him. And then in the middle of the sea, when storms come up, he calms the storms too. And it's almost as if he's fighting the devil on both sides of the sea and on the sea itself, and he establishes his authority everywhere he is. Okay? And then you have Jesus healing and feeding people and casting out demons, as I mentioned, on both sides of the sea, and then calms the storm, so that when the question of the disciples comes up at the end of the story, who is this that even the winds and the waves obey him? Then if they are remembering like Psalm 107 and other teachings about the Old Testament of God and the sea, they've got to come to the conclusion that this is God. Could this Jesus actually be God with us? And really, that's the best answer they could come up with, and actually a true answer. And so it's interesting to see how some of the background of the sea, both the mythology around it and also the teaching of the Old Testament, how that impacts the stories we're about to read right now. Okay, so let's go to the first story, and let's do Matthew's version of the story, even though I would recommend that after we read Matthew's version of the story, that you pause the video and then compare it with Mark's version in Mark 4 and Luke's version in Luke 8. It won't take but maybe 15 or 30 seconds in each one, and then we'll talk about the differences and similarities in this story. Okay, so first of all, let's read it from Matthew's version, chapter 8, verses 23 through 27. Then he got into the boat, and his disciples followed him. Suddenly, a furious storm came up on the lake, so that the waves swept over the boat. But Jesus was sleeping. The disciples went and woke him, saying, "Lord, save us, we're going to drown." He replied, "You have little faith. Why are you so afraid?" Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the waves, and it was completely calm. Again, that rebuke. Again, the idea of speaking to an entity maybe instead of just something created there. The men were amazed and asked, "What kind of man is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him." All right, so that's the story itself. Now let's go and show some of the pictures that also help us understand some of the background. Back in 1986, when the Sea of Galilee was at its lowest point in a number of years in the middle of a drought, there were two kind of amateur archaeologists that always had the dream of finding a boat from the first century, or at least from the first centuries near the time of Jesus. And so they're walking along the shore, further out than they normally would be. And sure enough, they find something that's like a piece of wood. And as they start to dig around it, they start to realize it's connected to other wood. And eventually they uncovered this boat. And the interesting thing is that over a process of like 11 days, they and their friends very carefully excavated this old wooden boat. And as they excavated, they realized that the air, which was around them, it was entering into this boat, and it was drying out wood that had been wet or had mud around it for maybe hundreds of years. And so it was starting to fall apart. So on the spot, these men and also some experts had to kind of invent a way to protect the wood as they uncovered it. And then they kind of ended up encasing it in a kind of foam that hardened after they put it on it. And then they floated it all the way across the sea to a place where it could be stored permanently. And I think it took like 9 years for the whole process of restoring and preserving this boat to be finished. But now it's at a museum at a place called Ginosar, Nov Ginosar, and you can go and see this boat. It's kind of made out of different pieces of wood, kind of pieced together with different kinds of wood, different kinds of nails and things like that. They think at first that it came from the first century, so they thought maybe this is exactly one of the kind of boats that Peter and the fishermen were in, or that Jesus rode in. But they realized that later on it was probably from the 3rd or 4th century, but still very similar to the kind of boats that Jesus and his disciples would have been in the story we just read. So if you ever get a chance, then go to this museum and see it. They've got a little movie about it, kind of interesting there. And then just a recreation of a boat. This is not an actual boat. They found a recreation near Ein Gev, I believe, and a 1st century type of boat. Get a little bit closer, you see the size of it. Usually these could hold between 12 to 20 men, and that would have been about the right size for the boat that Jesus and his disciples would have been in. And then you see that in one of the versions of this story, it talks about Jesus sleeping in the stern of the boat. And so you kind of imagine him sleeping in one of these areas while the storm is going on. Okay. Now, the interesting thing about this story are the differences or similarities there. Okay. Now, so again, if you want to pause the video now and quickly read the versions in Luke and in Mark, I want you to see what the differences are, and then come back and we'll talk about it. Okay, so what are the differences? There are some small things about, in one version there's boats, kind of like a little fleet of boats, and in Matthew's version just one boat. So there's some small differences there, but hopefully you noticed the order of events is different in Matthew than it is in Mark and Luke. And the difference is that when Jesus asked him the question, why are you so worried? Why are you so afraid? In verse 26, this happens before he calms the storm. So if you're looking at the versions in Mark and Luke, he gets up, they're desperate, he calms the storm, and then he turns around and asks him, why were you so afraid? And that version kind of makes more sense. We could see them saying, well, yeah, we understand now that we know that you have the power to calm the storm, but before the storm, I mean, how often have people calmed the storm like that? We thought we were going to drown. We thought we were going to die. And so you can kind of understand that order of events and how their feelings were. But then if you look at Matthew's version, verse 26, he asked them the question, why are you so afraid? While everything is still going on around him, while the wind's blowing, while the waves are crashing over the boat's rocking and about to sink. And in the middle of all that, he wants to have a discussion about how little faith they have. That seems a little bit odd. And so you can think, well, Jesus, let's talk about that later. Do whatever you can to help us, but we need you to help us right now. And so then it says he got up and rebuked the winds and the waves, and it was completely calm. All right. Now, if you look at Luke's version of this question, when he talks to the disciples, he doesn't say, ye of little faith, a phrase we hear often, or he doesn't say just afraid. The word in Greek that Jesus uses when he talks about them is deilos. It's coward, okay, which is a pretty strong word, okay? And if you look at the context, this is used like 5 times in the New Testament, only 5 times, and several of the occurrences are in the different versions of this story. But if you look up deilos in Greek in the lexicon, different meanings come up, but 2 that really struck me were one who always runs away and one who runs away at nothing. In other words, a coward is one who doesn't have the courage to face anything, basically. He always is scared. And that's the word that Jesus uses, okay? This is also the same word that you see in Revelation 21:8. It's in the list of people who will not inherit the kingdom, who won't get into heaven. And the cowards are the ones that won't get into heaven. And so this is a pretty serious accusation. If somebody comes up to me, especially in a situation like this, and they say, Steve, why are you afraid? You say, well, it's normal to be afraid in these situations. Or, honestly, I'm kind of scared. I might get hurt. I might lose my life. I mean, that's pretty normal. And if people said, why are you afraid or why are you scared? that really wouldn't offend me. I'd want to explain it, but I wouldn't be offended. But if somebody comes up to me and says, Steve, why are you such a coward? Now they're talking about my character. They're talking about my general way of reacting to things, that I have no courage, that I can't face anything, that I always try to run. That's a different accusation. And it's pretty strong for Jesus to use that word. And evidently it's a pretty important thing not to be a coward, because cowards are among those that don't get into heaven. And so that to me is pretty striking, and it shows you how important Jesus considers for us to have faith, to not be cowards, to not give up right away, or to run away always, or to run away at nothing, but that we need to, first of all, look to Jesus and see what he can do before we worry too much about the problem and only focus on the problem. And in this area, I have a part of a reading that I want to share with you here. And he talks about securing the boat or changing the weather. Okay, this is Dan Bushell is the president of MRN, Missions Resource Network, as I'm recording this video anyway. And he has been a minister for many years, often has some really interesting ideas. And so when he talks about this story, I'm going to read part of his blog that he wrote on it. He said, here's my question. What did the disciples expect Jesus to do? Clearly, they had some expectation. Surely they didn't just want Jesus conscious enough to know they were going to die. But from their stunned reaction to Jesus' rebuke of the storm, they didn't expect what happened. They had seen Jesus do some impressive things, but control the weather? No, that was beyond their capacity to imagine. So again, I ask, what did they expect Jesus to do? Maybe they hadn't thought it through. Maybe they were like children who cry out to their parents for help with a tummy ache or sore throat, not having any idea what help means. But if the disciples had any picture of what that help looked like, it must have been something much smaller, like helping them row, navigate, bail water, secure the rigging, or doing something else to make the boat more secure in the storm. Jesus knows something the disciples don't. What they needed wasn't a safer boat, they needed a weather change. He could bring calm without breaking a sweat. Any reasonably sound boat will do in weather conducive to sailing. Any boat that contains Jesus carries its own weather with it. That's such a great point. Jesus' disciples haven't changed much in all these years. When trouble comes, we still get preoccupied with the structural soundness of our vessel. We work on the ship of faith, frantically trying to secure it against the storm around us, assuming safety is found in the boat. I may not know much, but I think I know this. Whatever problem the church faces in the cultural storm around us, no structural solution alone will solve it. The issue is not the structural integrity of the boat. The critical issue is whether Jesus is in the boat with us. If he is, the boat is safe. If not, well, who cares? That boat's going to sink eventually anyway. If not in this storm, it will go down in another. So what do we need to do in a cultural storm? Given that we can't control the weather, I think there are only two things we can do. First, make sure we have Jesus along with us and trust him. Our relationship to God is primary, though this rarely is our chief concern in troubled times. And second, ask Jesus to change the weather. I think those are some great ideas, especially the one about any boat that has Jesus in it carries its own weather with it. And really, that's the question. Is Jesus with you or not? And that's going to be the same question we look at then in the next story as well. So let's go over to the Peter walking on the water story. And again, we're going to take Matthew's version of it, Matthew chapter 14. And this is just after the feeding of the 5,000 that we've already read. We'll start in verse 22. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You have little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." And so again, there's a recognition that Jesus and his ability to have power over the sea must be God. Okay. Now I want to give you just a little bit of background as we go through this story. First of all, I want to take you to a place where I think it's very likely that Jesus spent time praying. We're standing right on the edge of the road of the Via Maris, right with the Sea of Galilee right behind us. To our right up the hill is the Mount of Beatitudes, where the Sermon on the Mount was. And also in this general area to our left is the Church of the Multiplication of Loaves and Fishes. So it's possible this was close to the area that Jesus did the miracle of the 5,000. We're right in that neighborhood where traditionally they placed this miracle. And so it says that as they finished the day with the crowds, he dismissed the crowd, and then he sent the disciples on ahead of him across in the boat. Okay, and then it says he stayed alone, went up on the mountainside to pray. Now, it's interesting that in several opportunities when it says Jesus went out to a solitary place to pray, that the word in Greek used there is Eremos, E-R-E-M-O-S. And Eremos means a solitary place or like a desert-like place or even a place of pasture land kind of by itself outside of a town. The idea is it's a place that you can go to be alone. And the interesting thing is that in history, this mount here, besides being called the Mount of Beatitudes, has another name, Mount Eremos. And then if you look right in the middle of this picture up on the hill, you can kind of see a shadow here. We'll show you better later on. But this is a cave, and this is called the Cave of Eremos. And so I'm thinking that it's very possible, even likely, that this was a place Jesus came when he wanted to be alone and to pray, like in Mark 1, when he gets up early in the morning, goes out to an Eremos, a solitary place. This is only about a mile or two from Capernaum, where his home base was, where the miracles in Mark 1 happened. And so I'm thinking this could have very well been the place that he would come to pray. Maybe this was the place where he prayed all night before he picked his disciples. Maybe this is the place of the 5,000, and then he went up on this mountain, maybe into this cave to pray. I think it's a really good likelihood, even if it's not the exact spot, he was somewhere in this region, we know, close to the sea, near a mount, in a place alone where he could pray. And so this is kind of the overall view. Then if you go to the next slide here, you have the road, their little path that kind of goes up towards the cave and actually goes up around the cave up to like this big rock up here. So we're going to take you all the way up there. And now you're standing by the rock and you're looking out over the Sea of Galilee. You're looking back down this way toward the southern part there. You have the cliffs of Arbel over here. You have Gennesaret and this part of this here. And then on down here is Tiberias. This is a great place to stand and look. And then you have an even better view. If you look straight out over the Sea of Galilee, now you're actually standing right above the cave, almost on the roof of the cave. And you see down to the right here, the churches connected to the primacy of St. Peter and also the Church of the Loaves and Fishes once again. And then you see Tiberias in the distance down here. I gave you a little bit of context here now to how big the cave is. This is my wife and I standing in the mouth of the cave. So you see it's not a huge one, big enough to get in and sit down. And then if you do go inside, it's got some benches. And it's just an amazing thing. One of my favorite things in all of Israel is to go up and sit down inside this cave and think and read these stories and pray. Because you can just look out of the cave and you can just imagine these stories happening right here. And if this is indeed the place where Jesus went to pray, then you have a great view of the Sea of Galilee. Let me show you this and then one other picture really quickly. I want to show you just briefly another one of the 360 videos. Let me go ahead and set this up here. Okay. Okay, so again, you're standing now just in front of the cave, about where my wife and I were. And you're looking out. This is like late afternoon, probably about 5 in the afternoon. A beautiful view. You can see and hear the sea. You look on down this way, and you have Tiberias over this direction. And here's again the churches of the Loaves and Fishes and the Primacy of St. Peter. You have the path right here that goes up on top of the cave. Then you turn around and you look inside the cave, and you can't see very well inside. It's kind of dark. But again, it's maybe 6 or 8 feet deep and maybe about 12 feet wide. Keep on spinning around here. And then you see this road, the Via Maris, going up north. And again, about a mile or two down this road is Capernaum. So you could easily see this being the place where Jesus came and where he would be after this miracle happened with the feeding of the 5,000. Okay. Now, I tried to get as close as I could. Let me stop this and switch. I tried to get as close as I could to the time of day that this story might have happened. And so we're here in the cave and it's twilight. Would have been about the time that Jesus sent the crowd away, about the time that Jesus would have sent the disciples out on the sea. And this picture was taken from inside the cave. This is the view Jesus would have had of the sea. And so if you think about this story in the context, Mark 6:46, it says that he stayed behind to pray. In verse 48, it says Jesus saw the apostles rowing, getting tired because the boat was being buffeted by the wind and the waves. And so he notices they're having trouble. And you can see now how he could see them from the cave. And so when I was sitting in the cave and thinking about this story and remembering that, he could see them probably from here, it says that he went out to them. And part of me thought, well, why did he do that? Because he's Jesus. We've seen him perform miracles at a distance before without even going to the place. Why didn't he just stay in the cave? He was tired. It had been a really long day. It was hard out there. He could have just kind of mailed in that miracle in a sense and stayed in the cave. And yet he didn't. It says he went out to them. And I think he did it for at least 2 reasons. I think he went out just to be with them, the presence of Jesus. And then I also think he went out so that when he did the miracles around them, like walking on the water in this story, when Peter did his, so that they would know these miracles were because of his power. They were connected to him. And so it says that he went out to them, but it also says he went out at the 4th watch of the night. Now, if we're correct in understanding the watches system of the Jews, if the day starts at 6 p.m., then the watches are 3 hours long. And so if you look at the 4th watch of the night, there's 12 hours total from 6 to 6. Then the 4th watch of the night would have been like from 3 to 6 in the morning. So evidently he saw them, but then some time passed, maybe even several hours before he went out to them. And you wonder, why did he wait so long? You wonder if part of it was to give them the chance to realize they needed help and they really needed him. Or maybe it was to help them, try to do more things, become more independent in some ways, in a good way. We don't know exactly why he waited, but it says then he went out to them. Mark's version also adds a kind of a humorous detail. It says he was going to pass by them, kind of like, hey guys, as he went on his way to the other shore, but then they saw him and then he realized he needed to stop. And so in Matthew's version, verse 28, Peter asked if it was him. Now, you think about that, you think, well, that's a stupid question. Why do you need a sign if you know it's Jesus? Well, I mean, how often in the past had people been in a boat in the middle of the night and seen other people walking past them on the water? The most natural thing would be to think it's a hallucination or a bad dream or a vision or a ghost. But nobody would think up to this point, oh, it's a person out for a walk. And it's probably Jesus, because we know he was over there. He's probably just coming out, walking on the water. This was the first time they'd seen that. And so you can understand Peter wanting a sign. Lord, if it's really you, please tell me to come to you. Okay? And so he says, okay, well, it is me. Come on. And at that point, I wonder if Peter thought, why didn't I ask for a different sign? Lord, if it's you, send Andrew out to you on the water. Because then Peter needed to decide if he really thought that it was Jesus out there. And if it was Jesus and he believed him, then Jesus would help him walk on the water. And so Peter, to his credit, takes that step out of the boat. And you wonder what he was thinking as he steps out before he hits the water with that first foot. Did he think, I'm committing suicide? Did he think, what if this is just a vision? You wonder if other guys in the boat were saying, Peter, don't do this, Peter. And you just kind of wonder about what happened at those 30 seconds when all this was beginning. And yet then he steps onto the water and he walks. How cool would that be, right? I mean, that's just amazing. And he walks evidently several steps before then he begins to be afraid. And then he has problems and he sinks, and then Jesus saves him. And then when Jesus says, why did you doubt? It could be that Peter doubted because of the wind and the waves, or maybe he thought he doubted him, or maybe he may have doubted himself. Why did you believe that you could do this if I'm with you here on the water? Okay. And so I think it's just an interesting paradigm. Now, if you go on with the story, you've heard the publicity from several years ago, think outside the box. You remember who that was from, right? That's from Taco Bell, okay? Taco Bell says think outside the bun, actually, because they want you to think outside the bun. And maybe if we could extend that, we could say think outside the boat. Not outside the box or the bun, but think outside the boat, which is what Peter was doing. Because when he did this, he was changing his whole paradigm. Usually it's not safe to get out of the boat in the middle of the storm, but when he did something that nobody else in history besides Jesus just then had ever done, and he walked on the water. Okay? And so you ask the question, well, okay, in this story in particular, was it safer in the boat or outside of the boat? Okay? And in this story, at first, you would think, well, do everything you can to stay in the boat, because if you get outside the boat, for sure, you're going to drown. And that would have been true until Jesus got there. And then the safest place to be in the story, like in the first story, was wherever Jesus was. And if Jesus is with you, then you're going to be okay. All right? It may be a time of fear. It may be a time of difficulty. But if Jesus is there, eventually, you're going to be okay. And I've often wondered, after they got home that night, or maybe the next day, and people said, well, what did you do yesterday? Who had the best story to tell when they got home? It was Peter. And you know that probably guys being guys, that if in the future they were arguing about who's the greatest, as we know they did several times, I've got to think that this story came up at some point. Where Peter might have looked at him and said, now, if I remember right, how many of you guys got out of the boat and walked on the water? Oh, none of you. Okay. And Peter probably won that argument. So interesting to think about that. And then you think about us, and if we think outside the boat, what are some of the ways that we have gotten outside of the boat in our past? Or perhaps the ways that we could get out of the boat that we may be thinking about right now. I'm thinking that God and Jesus are always looking for us to step out, literally, in faith. There's always opportunities to do things that we've never done before, maybe that nobody has ever done before, and God is just waiting to surprise us and smiling, thinking about how your world could expand if you trust Jesus and got out of the boat. The problem is, of course, that it's scary, and sometimes getting out of the boat has never been done, without drastic consequences. And yet, when Jesus is around, then the safest place to be is wherever Jesus is, in any situation, any place. Now, as the story wraps up, then you see several different endings presented in the different Gospels. Matthew's version says, when they got in the boat, then the wind calmed down. Okay, so that's interesting. Again, it's kind of like a mirror of the other story, Jesus calming the storm. In John 6:21, in John's version, says when they got in the boat reached the other side. And I don't know if that means like it was immediately reaching the other side, or if it just said, and they made a safe journey. They finished it normally. And then in Matthew's version, of course, it also says they worshiped and were amazed. And that's really the end of the story that really sticks with us, is that they continue to wonder about who is Jesus, and if this Jesus really is God, then what could be possible for us and for the Jews as a nation. So great stories about Jesus and the Sea of Galilee. Hope this has been helpful to you. See you next time.